Hi everyone. Our presentation is going to be over Christianity and the LGBTQ plus community. We're going to talk a little bit about the article that we had introduced to all of you, as well as the history of the LGBTQ community in the church, where it's currently standing, and a little bit of some of the background and history, and so on and so forth.
LGBTQ plus community is traditionally rejected by Christianity, and this is because of the legalistic view of sin, and this thinks of sin as any defiance of God's commands. So it started when Adam and Eve disobeyed God and tainted like all of humanity, and this sin is like passed on through sexual acts. So sexuality is viewed as sinful because it's the means of way sin is passed on. But some theologians embrace this view and say that because we are all sinners and it doesn't matter like what our sexuality is, no matter like doesn't make anyone better than the other. Other theologians, however, look at sin differently. They find that sin is the opposition to what God has done for us in Jesus Christ, which was lift him up. So essentially, they believe that sin is the refusal of God's radical love. And because sin is seen as the refusal of God's radical love, the LGBTQ plus community is able to feel accepted by God. And radical love is love that is so extreme that it dissolves all kinds of boundaries, including gender and sexuality. So anything that reinforces boundaries or resists dissolving these boundaries is considered sin in their eyes. Um, Jesus Christ is seen as the one who recovers this radical love that humans have rejected from God. So the LGBTQ community views Jesus Christ as the embodiment of radical love and demonstrates a crossing of boundaries in like a number of ways. He first crosses divine boundaries because he is fully human and of flesh, while fully divine with his abilities to heal the sick and the diseased. But he also crosses social boundaries. And like as we've already learned, Jesus Christ interacts with the lower class and the poor, but also meets with like tax collectors. So he's not bound to one class or group of people, but sees everyone as like equals. And he also crosses sexual boundaries. Some theologians argue that Jesus was attracted to both men and women. And by passing all these boundaries, it shows how God's love is limitless and how he will love all. Um, Amanda will talk about how more in depth how he crosses gender boundaries as well. And then for members of the LGBTQ community, they can relate to Jesus Christ as well and how he's like treated in like the scriptures. He was yelled at in the streets like transgender people were and outcasted by his family so they can build like a relationship with Jesus Christ.
Paul wrote in Galatians that there is no longer male and female in Jesus Christ. So LGBTQ theologians argue that Jesus Christ is transgender as he breaks the barrier of gender and challenges societal norms. Jesus's idea of being non-binary challenges the binaries of society that continue to oppress women in the church. The perfect human created by God is both male and female. This was what our article was touching upon was exactly what it just said. The idea that Jesus is non-binary allows all into the church regardless of gender or gender identity and makes the church open to all individuals and backgrounds. So in this way, we can see that Jesus is accepting towards all genders, and also there are examples of him in which we can see that he doesn't really fit into those rigid roles. Okay. One other aspect we can look at, thanks to the article, is that of Jesus being able to cross rigid sexual boundaries. The idea that Jesus, as an embodiment of radical love, is one that can stretch to like sexual attraction, or it, as it says here, it dissolves the rigid line between heterosexual and homosexual. In the article, it also discusses the idea of a bi Christ, which it talks about how there's instances in which Jesus is seen as possibly being attracted to more than one sex, which is where the term bi Christ comes from. The overall idea is that because Jesus is radical love, the love cannot be contained into black and white categories or like rigid preconceived notions of sexual attraction, and there's a glorious ambiguity to it all. We also want to touch upon the idea of ending queer scapegoating. They talk about this a lot in the article about this need to get rid of the insider versus outsider mindset. They talk about how violence is often directed at a scapegoat and that this is whoever the outsider is at the time. And because Christianity can like heal this, because Jesus' life can be seen as standing for the end of the insider versus outsider mentality.
Okay, so as for the fight for LGBTQ plus individuals and are a part of the Christian community, the LGBTQ plus community in the Christian church have always existed, contrary to what the church may kind of convey onto the public or convey onto the general body. There have always been members of the queer community a part of the Christian community. They may just not have been as outspoken as they are in modern times. As time has progressed, there's been a lot more visibility for the LGBTQ plus community within society as a whole, especially as of recent, with non-binary and transgender identities becoming better accepted within the community, as well as gay marriage being legalized within recent years. There have been more voices coming from the church speaking out about their sexuality, and there's definitely been more approval from certain churches about accepting the LGBTQ plus community within their church and supporting them. However, it's definitely been an uphill battle for the LGBTQ plus community, plus allies and family members who do identify as Christians and are a part of a Christian community, as there are still many churches that face persecution for accepting queer individuals, and there are still churches that teach based around homophobic practices and the idea that being queer is ungodly and is an act of sin. Typically, it's rooted in words that come from the Bible or passages from biblical text that root some ideology that being queer is against God's desired code and that marriage and love is supposed to be between a man and a woman. However, it's been found in recent studies that a lot of the times there have been certain passages in scriptures used in the homophobic agenda that have been tweaked and critiqued and changed from their original translations, or certain words have been given different meanings from their original translations in order to push a political or social agenda by those who are against the queer community. There have been a lot more progressive churches in recent years that have come out to say that they are in support of the queer community as well. There's been a lot of queer Christians and church leaders have done work to untangle former messages of homophobia and kind of go back on earlier teachings of the church, specifically the Roman Catholic Church, who had come out and said that it was against the Bible and it was against God to be gay. There was actually a bishop who is a part of the Anglican Church that came out and said, as Christians, we must learn to accept people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans as children of God. There have always been LGBT people in the church, and there always will be. This idea stems from the idea that we're all people of God, and there is no true sin that is too great to separate an individual from Christ's love and the resurrection of Jesus Christ and his salvation. And the idea that there is one specific sin other than denying Christ's resurrection and his ability to save all us from our sins has zero jurisdiction and isn't justified within any church or within any passage of the Bible, as it truly is that it has been taught through many churches as of recent that the only true sin that separates an individual from God is denying his resurrection and his ability to save us from our sins, and that all sins are primarily equal. However, there are certain churches that have a hierarchy on where each sin lies. There is only one predominant sin that keeps people from Jesus, and that would be the denying Jesus of his rights towards resurrection.
So we wanted to give some examples of some anti-LGBTQ crimes. There was a bill to stop anti-LGBTQ crimes, but it was actually shot down after the Vatican showed clear sentiment against it. In Texas, 3 men were sentenced to prison for using dating apps to target gay men for violent crimes. And then in Louisiana, a man was indicted for attempted murder of a gay man and plotting to kidnap and murder other gay men. Next slide. So I wanted to touch on the potential future of the LGBTQ plus community and Christianity. Finding acceptance in Christian churches can be a challenge and ultimately a test of faith. Many LGBTQ plus people feel unwelcome in most major religions and are unlikely to identify as Christian. So then the challenge for Christian churches becomes, how can a Christian church best welcome an LGBTQ plus person? So we think churches can affirm those who are LGBTQ which is just proclaiming that they are welcome and belong as members of their church. And by welcoming those in the LGBTQ plus community, the church gives a face and familiarity to the other members of the church. And in doing so, Christian churches can become welcoming places for those of the LGBTQ community and serve as like a role model for other religions.
Beautiful people. Today we have Rocky Roggio. She is the director / producer of 1946, the movie. Hi, Rocky.
Hey, how are you?
I'm not too shabby. We are going to really spend our time in this conversation just educating everyone that's here to listen on the mistranslation that we've been given in the Bible about homosexuality and sexual, quote, perversion and these sorts of things. And before we begin, I just want to sort of invite everyone from every perspective into this conversation. Rocky and I are both going to frame it as inviting as possible because there's a lot we can learn. We've been passed down, as you were saying, Rocky, before we started recording, we've been passed down certain ideas and certain thoughts about our religion that have now become like God says, thus saith the Lord. And it's really stunning when you peel back that curtain of certainty and you realize that there are mistranslations in there and that we've been essentially lied to, whether it was an error of translation or whether it was something motivated by more darkness and evil than that, which I kind of imagine it vacillates between both. But I'm so excited to learn from Rocky. So important to point out the way homosexuality was seen in the 1940s and 50s, which is something that you also bring up in the documentary. So when you talk about these people that didn't have ill motivations, that were earnest seekers of the truth, that ended up adding the word homosexuality, they were coming from a perspective where homosexuality, being LGBTQ, was a mental disorder, correct?
Absolutely.
Can you explain the difference between the way homosexuality was seen in the 1940s versus how it flipped to the 70s? And then we'll get back into this young advocate who back in the 40s knew the truth.
Absolutely. And it actually comes out through the series of letters that they discovered. Because David knowing he was homosexual, but he knew he wasn't a predator. And so back during those days, somebody who would abuse young boys, they would be a homosexual abuser. And these are homosexual vices. And they didn't even understand the difference between, it wasn't even homosexual or heterosexual. It was really more or less men abusing young boys. And so they just called it homosexual abusers because they didn't have an understanding of people actually having an orientation and a natural attraction, and something that's not a choice. And so, yeah, it was looked at as mentally ill, criminal, and those types of things. It was linked with pedophilia, and it's been linked with pedophilia for years.
Mm-hmm.
But there was never an understanding of monogamous or even just consensual. Don't forget about monogamous, just consensual adults engaging in a sex act that is appropriate.
Right.
Or for the conservatives, if we want to talk about trying to bring in LGBTQ members in the church, then we want to talk about monogamy with a committed partner, and then introduce a marriage commitment that you can absolutely uphold biblically, one man and one man.
Yeah.
Forever. I mean, it's the idea of it's commitment. It's about taking a vow with someone and protecting someone and having trust with someone, which obviously the Christian community has no problem with divorce. They just throw that out the window, and the priests allowed them to get divorced because, I mean, no one would ever go to church if you